Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 10, The Guilt of the Liberal.
It has been more than once remarked that modern liberalism, as manifest within the relatively privileged strata of Western society, bears, only lightly concealed, a heavy burden of guilt. To uncover a layer of guilt inside the liberal breast is not, to be sure, a startling discovery. Guilt seems to be an emotion, feeling, idea, conviction, whatever it is to be called, that is very widely distributed among men. If one were not committed to a denial of any permanent human nature, one might almost conclude that it is part of man's essence. In Franz Kafka's novel The Trial, Joseph K., symbol of the mathematical constant, every man presumably as well as author and particular reader, is informed by authoritative sources that he is under indictment. K. never succeeds in finding out the specifications of the charge. But it becomes quite clear that they are of a capital order, and that he is indeed guilty, since he has already been condemned to death, with no possibility of reprieve. Every man, conservative and liberal, communist and fascist, atheist and churchgoer, is of course exactly in K's situation, and, no matter what his doctrine, he feels at least sometimes the reality of that situation, that is, feels guilty. And occasionally he feels guilty not about this or that deed or thought, but guilty in general, guilty about nothing in particular, that is, about everything. Guilt and the feeling of guilt are facts of the human situation. Christianity, the traditional religion of Western civilization, faces the reality of guilt, provides an adequate explanation for it, and offers a resolution of the anxiety to which it inevitably gives rise. Each man is guilty merely by being a man, because the entire human race, in the person of its progenitor, committed a supreme crime. The exact content of this crime or sin is obscure, but its infinite measure is known from the fact that it was done in defiance of the will of the infinite being who is creator at once of the world and of man himself. Every man is therefore born with this guilt, and, since it is infinite, neither any man nor all men together can, solely by their own efforts, wipe it out. God himself, however, freely chose the only possible solution, if there was to be a solution, that he, the infinite being, should himself become incarnate as man, and sacrifice himself, so that through this infinite sacrifice man, and men, might be redeemed from their infinite guilt. The sacrifice having been carried out, men may be released from the guilt by being baptized in his name, believing in him and doing his will. This Christian doctrine does genuinely solve the problem of guilt, or at any rate, gives a framework, so long as it is believed, within which the problem in all its complexities becomes tractable to both understanding and emotion. Liberalism, however, is secular at least in tendency and emphasis even when individual liberals are or regard themselves as Christians. Many liberals or liberal ancestors, of the 18th century Enlightenment, for example, have openly broken with Christianity. Many more continue to consider themselves Christians but have abandoned most of the orthodox dogma and doctrine, which they often reinterpret as myth, metaphor or symbol. Moreover, for most persons today, non-liberal as well as liberal, religious belief has become departmentalized, restricted in its influence on life and conduct, and relatively independent of political, economic and social views. But the Christian solution of the problem of guilt is valid only if the relevant Christian doctrine is true, and it can be psychologically effective only when the doctrine is believed, whether or not true, and believed not in a mere formal and atomistic way, as one truth among the many others, but integrally and totally, as pervading all of life and experience. Let us consider the situation of a member of our affluent society, and let us assume him to be from the more rather than less affluent half, who is no longer deeply committed in spirit to the interlocked Christian doctrines of original sin, the incarnation and redemption, which constitute the Christian solution. His guilt nevertheless exists, he is conscious of it, and feels the anxiety that it generates. What is he going to do about it, and think about it? Liberalism permits him to translate his guilt into the egalitarian, anti-discrimination, democratist, peace-seeking liberal principles, and to transform his guilty feeling into that passion for reform of which Professor Shapiro speaks. If he is an activist, he can actually sign on as a slum clearer, freedom rider, ban the bomber or peace corpsman, or join a Dr. Schweitzer or Dr. Dooley in the jungle. But activists of that literal sort are always a minority. The more significant achievement of liberalism, by which it confirms its claim to being considered a major ideology, is its ability to handle the problem of guilt for large numbers of persons without costing them undue personal inconvenience. This it does by elevating the problem to representational, symbolic and institutional levels. It is not necessary for me to go in person to the slum, jungle, prison, southern restaurant, state house or voting precinct and there take a direct hand in accomplishing the reform that will unblock the road to peace, justice and well-being. Thanks to the reassuring provisions of the liberal ideology, I can go about my ordinary business and meanwhile take sufficient account of my moral duties by affirming my loyalty to the correct egalitarian principles, voting for the correct candidates, praising the activists and contributing to their defense funds when they get into trouble, and joining promptly in the outcry against reactionaries who pop up now and then in a desperate effort to preserve power and privilege. The key fact toward which I am pointing here is really very simple, a product not of complicated analysis but of common sense observation. My own observations have confirmed it time after time over a good many decades, and I cannot believe that my experience is so very different from that of other men, besides which, it is discussed, directly and indirectly, in the writings of many liberals and non-liberals. Indeed, I remember very well the first time I became aware of this key fact I am trying to get at here. It was about 35 years ago. I became acquainted then with the first fully ideologized female liberal I had known. She was a member of a fairly sizable and important class in modern American society, the class of indoctrinated liberal, sometimes more left than liberal, women turned out over a period of many years by Vassar and her sister institutions of the female Ivy League, many of them destined to become the rather formidable wives of men who have had much to do with making liberalism our prevailing national ideology. At one time I was, in a modest way, something of a student of this species. This first specimen I knew well was the daughter of a wealthy investment banker. Her family had the usual large house just off Fifth Avenue in the East 70s, summer place on the Long Island shore, and auxiliary outbuildings here and there. She used to invite budding young intellectuals, a few of her classmates, and sometimes a communist or young trade union organizer, to dinner, and as the butler and footmen passed the food and wine there would be animated discourse about that hardy perennial of economic disaster, the West Virginia coal fields, along with the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, sharecropping in the South, the latest demonstrations by the unemployed, and British oppression in India, all dealt with from a systematically progressive point of view. It was obvious on the face of it, and in the rhetoric they used and the sentiments they expressed, that this girl and many of her friends felt guilty, felt a personal sense of guilt toward the poor, the wretched and the oppressed, and that this sense of guilt was an important, perhaps the decisive, ingredient in the liberal ideas they had adopted concerning the condition of the poor and wretched, its cause and its cure. Ideas that were, it may be added, far from accurate on most counts. The particular girl whom I am here remembering was entirely sincere in both her feeling of guilt and its translation into principle. It led her, shortly after the period of those dinners, to leave her family household and set up on her own in a sparely furnished apartment, where the only inharmonious object held over from the old days was her magnificent mink coat which she had taken along in all innocence, I believe, never having thought of it as a luxury. She married a determinately non-Ivy League type and they actually did spend several years working for unemployed leagues and the United Mine Workers in West Virginia. Along one perspective, liberalism's reformist, egalitarian, anti-discrimination, peace-seeking principles are, or at any rate can be interpreted as, the verbally elaborated projections of the liberal sense of guilt. I, who have enough to eat and a sufficiently comfortable life, feel guilty, even though I have no direct personal relation with you, because you are hungry or deprived of civil rights or suffering political oppression. More exactly, the sequence is the following: I feel guilty, and I do not know why, you are hungry, etc. I attach my guilt to your unhappy state, trying to explain my guilt to myself, to give it some sort of objective, motivating structure. All this may be too obvious to need saying. And it is obvious, but it is necessary to insist that it is not self-evident and not an inevitable outcome for the guilt experience. The generalized feeling of guilt toward mass wretchedness and oppression is so widespread today and so pervasive a characteristic of public rhetoric that many persons do not realize it to be a rather new arrival in history. Comparatively few people felt this sort of guilt before the present century, and virtually no one before the second half of the 18th century, though there has never been any lack of wretched and oppressed in this world. Nor is a feeling of guilt the only motivation there has been and can be for the attempt to improve the condition of the poor. The hardy breed of Calvinist-slanted early bourgeois, or bourgeois-minded, felt plenty of guilt, but none over the poor and wretched who, their doctrine told them convincingly, had only their own shiftlessness and extravagance to blame for their troubles. In many cultures the more fortunate were contemptuous or simply indifferent toward the wretched. Many have reconciled themselves to the sorrows of mankind by accepting them as God's will, and others, like Lucretius, have viewed them with a calm objectivity as part of the way things are. And I or another might choose to try to better the lot of the wretched because I thought it God's command that I should do so, or out of a feeling of noblesse oblige, from charity or civic duty, or because I preferred a happier world for its own sake, none of which motives need presuppose any sense of guilt on my part. The liberals' feeling of guilt at the condition of the wretched and oppressed is irrational, and irrational precisely from the point of view of the liberal ideology itself. According to liberal doctrine, the poverty and oppression are the result of ignorance and faulty institutions handed down from the past, they are none of my doing. Why then should I feel that any guilt attaches to me, individually and personally, because there are the poor and the enslaved? It has lately become morally fashionable to say,
"The white people of the United States have exploited and oppressed the American Negroes for 300 years, and now it is the moral obligation of the whites to make up for all the suffering they have caused."
And analogously,
"The white Europeans kept hundreds of millions of black, brown, and yellow Afro-Asians in colonial subjection for up to 500 years, and now it is the moral obligation of the Europeans to make up for that crime not only by freeing all the colonies but by giving them massive help to attain quickly a high standard of living."
It will be noticed that by these injunctions the ideal of equality of treatment for the heretofore privileged and underprivileged groups has evolved into the demand for an inequality in favor of the underprivileged, and this transformation has been openly acknowledged by the leaders of both American Negro organizations and the new African countries. Now it may be that American and European whites have such moral obligations, but it is certain that they cannot be derived from liberal principles. Liberal theory is atomistic and quantitative, and in particular rejects organic conceptions of society, which liberalism believes to be correlated with reactionary and fascist types of social regime. The idea that I, today, am organically part of a white race that was doing something, anything at all, to American or African Negroes or Indonesian brown men or Hindus or Bantu is total nonsense from the point of view of liberalism's philosophical conceptions. In fact, the very concept of a race of human beings is so difficult to reconcile with liberal doctrine that many liberal anthropologists and philosophers, including the late Franz Boas and his pupils, who constitute the most influential American school of anthropology, rule it out. If a race doesn't even exist, it is hard to see how it can be guilty. And there is a milder paradox, for liberal theory, even in the idea of an integration to be achieved through a struggle by Negroes for their rights. The struggle is conceived in terms that differentiate the Negroes from the rest of the population, but the goal, in terms that assimilate the Negroes within the population. However, theoretical paradoxes, inconsistencies or confusions are of little importance. The feeling of guilt with its accompanying anxiety is rooted much too profoundly to be affected by the quibbles of reason. Guilt is integral to liberalism, and the feeling of guilt is an integral element in the liberal motivation, with all the weighty consequences that follow therefrom for both individual conduct and social practice. The guilt of the liberal causes him to feel obligated to try to do something about any and every social problem, to cure every social evil. This feeling, too, is non-rational. The liberal must try to cure the evil even if he has no knowledge of the suitable medicine or, for that matter, of the nature of the disease. He must do something about the social problem even when there is no objective reason to believe that what he does can solve the problem, when, in fact, it may well aggravate the problem instead of solving it.
We cannot stand idly by while the world rushes to destruction, or women and children are starving, or able men walk the streets without jobs, or the air becomes polluted, or Negroes can't vote in Zenith, or immigrants live in rat-infested slums, or youngsters don't get a decent education.
Or whatever. The harassed liberal is relentlessly driven by his humanidian guilt. It does not permit him to let well enough alone, or stick to his own cabbage patch, or decide that the trouble is none of his business, or to reflect that, though the evil is undoubtedly there and he is sincerely sorry for its victims, he doesn't understand damn all about it, and even if he did, he hasn't got the brains and resources to fix it up. He may not know much, generally speaking he does not know much, about economics, but that lack in no way inhibits him from demanding that industry and government do this, that or the other to cure unemployment. He may not have a single serious idea about strategy in international affairs, but he will nevertheless join his fellow liberals in calling for grandiose measures concerning arms, alliances, bases, and colonies. He may have no acquaintance with the actual problems of mass education, but he will nevertheless insist on the most far-reaching reforms of the school system. The peoples of the new underdeveloped nations are hungry, poor and diseased. Therefore, by the logic of the liberal guilt, we have a duty to give them aid, and we do so, though the objective evidence may show that in at least a number of cases the aid given injures rather than helps the recipient, corrupts the officialdom perhaps, subverts the social order, or provokes wild inflation. Our government is obligated to send money to rehabilitate a chronically depressed domestic region, though the objective evidence may show that the area is depressed for good reason, and that the way to help its inhabitants is to get them to move somewhere else. Negro children have feelings of inferiority and alienation when they attend separate schools, so therefore they will go to school with whites. But what if, placed in direct confrontation with whites, the Negro children feel still more alienated? Indonesians have been poor under Dutch colonial rule, so therefore, etc. But after independence they are not merely poor but starving. Latin America is in bad political, economic and social shape. So we will have a $20 billion Alliance for Progress program. But, for this and that objective reason, the program will not improve the condition of Latin America, will most likely make it worse. No matter, there is a problem, where there's a problem we've got to apply a solution. I do not raise the question whether in these cited cases the liberal solution is or is not valid, but merely that it doesn't really make any difference. The real and motivating problem, for the liberals, is not to cure the poverty or injustice or what not in the objective world but to appease the guilt in their own breasts, and what that requires is some program, some solution, some activity, whether or not it is the correct program, solution and activity. The good intention, slum clearance, racial equality, better health, decolonization, high standard of living, peace, plus plenty of action is assumed to guarantee the goodness of the program, and the badness, one might add, of those reactionaries who are rash enough to question it. For Western civilization in the present condition of the world, the most important practical consequence of the guilt insisted in the liberal ideology and psyche is this, that the liberal, and the group, nation or civilization infected by liberal doctrine and values, are morally disarmed before those whom the liberal regards as less well off than himself. I remember learning one manifestation of this attitude for the first time in practice in the same year that I met the female liberal to whose memory I paid tribute earlier in this chapter. I was teaching then at New York University, which was a pioneer in racial integration. Indeed, as a big university in so cosmopolitan a city as New York, with its large Negro community, the issue never really arose. I soon found out that there was an unwritten rule providing that Negro students should be marked about 2 grades higher than whites for a given level of work. If a newcomer on the faculty deviated in his innocence from this rule when he turned in his first midterm grade sheets, discreet words to the wise were communicated to him by his older colleagues, so that no lasting damage would be done by an unsuitable end-of-term grade that would have gone into the student's permanent record. One literal-minded young instructor, who refused to take those prudent hints, found himself the physical focus of the dean's office, the student's parents and uncle, a delegation from the NAACP, and a suave representative of City Hall. Naturally the liberals on the faculty, that is, most of the faculty, had no difficulty justifying this rule to themselves, though they never did get around to recognizing it in public. The Negro students, they could explain, had come from inferior, usually segregated schools, they did not have an educated family background, conditions at home were difficult, they had to work on the side, it was important not only for them but for their people, the city and the nation that they should not be discouraged, and so on. Still, the fact remained, and this urbane New York University custom can be matched by 1,000 comparable practices today, yesterday and tomorrow. I recall an evening not long ago that I spent with one of the country's most distinguished historians, who is a liberal à outrance. As the night wore on, he got somewhat more tight than was his habit, and at one point he remarked, more to his fifth gin and tonic than to the rest of us.
In the last 10 years I've had several hundred Indians and Pakistani and lately Africans in my graduate courses, and I've given out many an A, and never flunked any of them, and there hasn't yet been a single one who was a really first-class student.
These academic forgeries are petty enough affairs, but often the moral disarmament is more startling, and more consequential. Consider, for example, terror, I mean the terror that tortures and kills people, a rather pervasive trait of our time. The terror carried out by the French paratroops in Algeria, let us take a specific case, and subsequently by Europeans of the so-called secret army, aroused the full-scale, sustained indignation and protest of liberals in Europe and America. But somehow the indignation was less ardent and the protest much muted in the case of the terror that was carried out by the Arab so-called Army of National Liberation, though, in point of fact, the Arab terror came first, was far more ferocious, lasted much longer, still goes on, indeed, and has had 100 times as many victims, most of them, as it happens, fellow Arabs. The Algerian case is in no way exceptional. The Mau Mau terror in Kenya in the early 1950s, exercised almost entirely against other Negroes, was one of the most bestial in history. However, Western liberals never became much worked up about it, and were stirred to much greater passion and political activity against the stern and occasionally brutal, but incomparably less savage, police measures taken against it by the British authorities. There has never been a liberal protest against the outrages committed by the South African Negroes. There has never been a liberal condemnation of the savage terrorism that the Angolan revolutionaries unleashed in 1961 in their attempt to overthrow Portuguese rule in Angola, during which they killed thousands of persons, mostly Negroes, by burning, torture, sawing and miscellaneous brutalities. The liberals' condemnation has been reserved exclusively for the Portuguese who fought back, perhaps for an unjust cause but for the most part without terrorist excesses. As with terror, so with colonialism. Liberal opinion has demanded and demands that the advanced Western nations, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, liquidate forthwith all forms of direct and indirect colonial rule, without reference to economic or strategic interests or the readiness of the peoples for independence or the question whether independence will in truth benefit or harm them, or to any other factor save the abstract badness of colonialism. Liberals implement this injunction by giving political, propaganda, financial and other practical support to the anti-colonial movements and their leaders, and by trying, usually successfully, to swing their own governments and the United Nations into action on the anti-colonial side. But when an underdeveloped nation goes actively colonial, when Nehru moves into Goa, or Sukarno into New Guinea or northern Borneo, there is at most a little clucking from the liberal backbench. No public protests, no letters to the newspaper, no resolutions in the United Nations, no invitations to resistance leaders, no committees to aid the threatened Papuans or Sarawakians, or whatever they are properly to be called. Analogously, in the United Nations, any amount of stupidity, rudeness, demagogy, barbarism or sheer ignorance from a spokesman of the ex-colonial and other underdeveloped nations goes unreproved, and no reference is made to the tyrannical and savage deeds that may be taking place in his home country. Within the United States, as in other advanced Western nations, the same moral asymmetry is present. The liberal community not only flagellates itself with the abusive writings of a disoriented Negro homosexual, but awards him money, fame and public honors. The spokesmen of the black Muslims can openly preach racial hatred, violence and insurrection to their heart's content, with never a challenge from police, courts or the self-appointed guardians of civil liberties. The guilt of the liberal is insatiable. He deserves, by his own judgment, to be kicked, slapped and spat on for his infinite crimes. The shooting of a Negro in Mississippi, purportedly the act of a crazed and isolated white man, reverberates from liberal sounding boards into weeks of world headlines. The shooting of white men in Maryland by rioting Negro gangs slides back into an obscure and unread paragraph. The truncheons of hard-pressed police struggling to preserve the minimum elements of public order against unloosed chaos become satanic pitchforks, the rocks and broken bottles of the mob, angelic swords. The force that blocks an entrance to a factory which a union leadership has declared on strike is a courageous defense of the rights of man. The force that might seek to use that entrance for its intended and lawful purpose is a cowardly blow by the hirelings of the privileged. Judging a group of human beings, a race, nation, class or party, that he considers to possess less than their due of well-being and liberty, the liberal is hard put to it to condemn that group morally for acts that he would not hesitate to condemn in his fellows, not to speak of reactionaries. His feeling of guilt and his egalitarian principles, which incorporate and express that feeling, do not seem to give him the right to condemnation. Even if, because of an imperious practical situation, he finds himself resisting the pretensions of the underprivileged group, he does so with a divided conscience. If he has to shoot one of its members, and sometimes in the end he must, and rather more of them than if he had stood firm a little earlier, he feels a moral twinge that often spoils his aim, as he pulls the trigger. When the Western liberal's feeling of guilt and his associated feeling of moral vulnerability before the sorrows and demands of the wretched become obsessive, he often develops a generalized hatred of Western civilization and of his own country as part of the West. We can frequently sense this hatred in the paragraphs of such American magazines as The Nation and Dissent, Britain's New Statesman, France's L'Express or Germany's Der Spiegel. A Western retreat or humiliation at the United Nations or Suez, in Cuba or space or Southeast Asia, becomes the occasion not for analysis, regret, sorrow or stock-taking, but for vindictive and smugly pleased I told you so's. In one of the critical discussions to which much of the material of this book was submitted as it moved along the production line, a liberal commented, after I had used the Algerian case as an example of the moral asymmetry.
It is true that there is among liberals this asymmetry of which you speak, this selective indignation, and it is true that in relation to the Algerian affair, the liberal protest was directed against the French paras, not the fellaheen. However, this is in keeping with the highest dictates of morality, which has always decreed that we must be much stricter with ourselves than with others. The French are ours, fellow members of Western, Christian civilization, educated and materially privileged. That they should descend to acts of terror, even if on a minor scale, deserves our moral condemnation much more than the terror of the Arabs, belonging to a different civilization with ideals we deem lower than ours, for the most part illiterate and impoverished, and for a century and a half subject to the oppression of a foreign power.
The force of his observation was somewhat weakened by the fact that this particular liberal happened to be not a Christian but an avowed atheist, of Jewish origin, who denies that Western civilization is in any respect superior to any other civilization, and who, in the Algerian affair, from the beginning identified himself not with the French but the anti-French side. If his argument were valid, the realities of his own point of view should have led him to excuse the French and direct his condemnation toward the Arabs. But the argument itself, though it draws on a profound moral truth, is not really relevant to the problem to which it is here applied, and even if it were, it could not be properly used by a liberal. It is true that as a moral being, I ought to judge myself more strictly than others, ought to forgive others more readily than myself, and ought to be especially generous in forgiving the lowly and unfortunate, and to forgive irrespective of race, color, creed or previous condition of servitude. But this means others as individuals and myself as an individual. The metaphor by which we extend moral categories to groups, a race, class or nation, is doubtful and confusing. A group does not possess either intellect or will, the presuppositions of moral conduct, and is therefore, strictly speaking, outside the range of moral judgment whether in praise or blame. And liberals most particularly, in terms of their own doctrine, have no basis for those moral distinctions among groups, in favor of, specifically, the poor, wretched and oppressed, that they do nevertheless habitually make. Reasoning from quantitative and atomistic premises, as I have noted, liberalism has always rejected Platonist, Hegelian and other realist or organic conceptions of society that assign some sort of subsistent reality to the group. It makes a certain amount of sense for a Hegelian to speak of the historic guilt of this race or that empire, or the moral claim of that people, but it makes no logical sense for a liberal to do so. It is the guilt, not the reason, of the liberal that is being expressed in these attitudes. Moreover, whatever may be the respective crimes, virtues and deserts of various races, classes and nations, civilized society requires a certain rule and order to hold back from the edge of anarchic savagery where it is always precariously poised. Human beings must have at least a minimum security in life and property, must be able to move through the streets and between the cities, must accept certain common rules in their mutual intercourse, or civilization does not exist. If this necessary order is subverted, the civilization is destroyed, whether the subversion take place from the best or worst of motives, whether or not it is in some supposedly moral sense justified, whether it is carried out by saints or devils. At some point the guardians of a civilization must be prepared to draw the line. Christian doctrine, if it is true, solves the problem of guilt in general and provides a structure within which the individual who believes in Christian doctrine may solve the problem of his individual guilt. But though guilt has so integral a role to play in the liberal attitude and conduct, liberal ideology does not succeed in solving the problem of guilt. As we have seen, it does not supply an intelligible explanation of the fact of guilt. Nor does it offer the individual any final answer to, that is, redemption from, his individual guilt. The work of secular education and reform undertaken to appease the liberal's guilt at the same time expresses and even irritates it. This must be, for there is no end, no terminal point, of the work of secular education and reform. This vacuum is reflected in the ideology and rhetoric of liberalism. It accounts for the emphasis on continuous change, on method rather than results, on striving and doing rather than sitting and enjoying.
We are forced back on the reality of the struggle.
Arthur Schlesinger concludes in his usual somewhat breathless tone.
The choice we face is not between progress with conflict and progress without conflict. The choice is between conflict and stagnation. Out of the effort, out of the struggle alone, can come the high courage and faith which will preserve freedom.
Within the universe of liberalism there is no point at which the spirit can come to rest, nowhere and no moment for the soul to be able to say, "In His will is our peace."